Mormanjika. And Yaradu Marang means simply good day. Good day, you lot. And you're the best lot I've seen on the screen all day. You're the only lot I've seen on the screen all day. It's nice to be here with you. I attach my acknowledgement to Fiona's and acknowledge that I am here on the land of the Bunurong people, and I honour their elders, and I honour those memories that are in the place in which I live and work. One of the things that I want to say in the start, before I start my presentation, is that it would be very wrong of me to say what I'm about to say is a uniform, universal, Aboriginal model, and it would be a universal, and all Aboriginal people who you talk about restorative justice would have the same opinion as me. They don't. There's 250 language groups. We're quite a diverse group of people. We have different opinions, so no Aboriginal person would attempt to say that what they're saying and what they think and what they see is what everybody thinks and sees. So you can't just simply take what I say and go away and say this is the universal way of dealing with these things. There is similarities in practices. That's why we have things called song lines, because song lines are the transferring of knowledge and wisdom across the country. As you travel, you pick up new ways of doing things. So yes, there would be things that look like this, but this is my understanding that came out of the statement from the heart and from my discussions over the years looking at what practices may have been in with our peoples before the boat people arrived here in 1770 something. So that's just a little precursor, because you might say, I heard Glenn Loughrey say this, and others will say, well, we don't quite see it exactly that way. And that's okay, because we like diversity. What I'm going to show you, and I'm putting my slides up now. Where did it go? Okay, I have some background sound there. Here we are. Can you see that?
We can, Glenn. If you wanted to do the slideshow, it'll come up bigger.
Oh, goody. That's all these things that I have to learn to do. It
Yep.
is. Okay. This is built out of my Wiradjuri language, and it's based on a dialogue model that comes out of the statement from the heart. The statement from the heart, while it was an invitation for Australian people to engage with First Nations people through voice and recognition in the Constitution, had within it a set of processes that were historical in the sense that they were part of traditional practice prior to the Empire arriving in Australia. We talked about in the statement from the heart, if you remember in the guts of the paper, it was about voice, treaty, truth, and Makarrata. They were the four things. I think somebody's got their microphone on.
I'm trying to find. I'll go through and turn the microphones on.
Okay. So there were the four things that sat at the centre of the statement from the heart: voice, treaty, truth, and Makarrata, with the outcome being justice, or in the model that I'm putting forward here, wholeness, because in our language we don't have a word for justice, but we have a word that talks about how we are made whole again after we've been broken and separated and issues occur. This model sits as a way of conflict resolution within a small group of people, which most clans and tribes were, 2 or 3 families gathered, that lived together and moved around together, and they lived in a way that they relied upon every member of that group. If there was issues within them in that group, then they need to be resolved fairly quickly. Otherwise, you ran the risk of splitting the group and putting both groups then at risk in what was always a hostile environment. Living in the bush all the time. It wasn't utopia. There was quite a lot of conflict and quite a lot of risk of being in that space. So you needed everybody to be on the same page to be able to do the jobs that were necessary. That's the reason why there were people responsible for various knowledges inside an Aboriginal group. No one person held all the knowledge, because if something went wrong, you lost the information that you needed. So it was shared amongst them. So to keep the knowledge whole, you needed to keep the group whole. So if you had conflict and issues, you had to have a process that allowed you to resolve it in the context of where you were, space and time, and in the now, and not allow it to fester and grow into a major issue. It is the reason why we have so much trouble with when our young people and others are put into jails, because this particular process that I'm going to talk about can't be done on Zoom, and it can't be done when somebody's in a prison cell 250 miles away from where the issue occurred. You have to be in the space, and you have to be breathing the same air to be able to bring about these kind of conflict resolution processes. So, for example, I'll outline the theory of this model, then I'll give you an example so that we can work through it from that point of view, so it has some more legs. And the word Winangara at the top is really about, not so much about voice in the sense that we talk about, I have a voice and I can say my truth. There's no use having a voice to say your truth unless somebody recognizes you and hears that truth. Okay? You can't just have a voice if there is no one there to listen. That was the difficulty with the referendum. To give us a voice, you had to recognize us. If you don't recognize us, you can't hear us because we don't exist. So Winangara is about the practice on both sides of listening, hearing, and reflecting. Listening to the other person, hearing what is deeply...
Recording in progress.
Where did that go?
I think we've just been joined by someone. That's all right.
Okay. You have to be able to listen and hear and reflect. Listen to what they're saying, hear what the real issues are inside that, and take time to reflect about what that means to you and to others. Learning to listen. Learning to listen so each hears each other's stories and allows space to reflect. And above all else, you do nothing in that first stage. It's the first stage of the process. You allow each person to speak, you allow each person to hear, and you allow each person to reflect. There's no conversation, it's just that process of listening, hearing, and reflecting. And that is important because you must set that basis of recognition. If somebody makes a complaint, then it needs to be recognized, but also the person who the complaint was made about must be heard and recognized as well in that process. Otherwise, it's one-sided and doesn't have the power to change. People become defensive if they're not heard. And the second section of this is that you go to treaty. Now, treaty is a pretty simple thing. Treaty is that I see you, I hear you. How are we going to live together in this space? How are we going to share what is here? How are we going to share the resources, the space? how are we going to live together? Because now I've recognized that you exist. In this conflict resolution process, it's when we have listened, heard, and reflected, and then we discuss together and agree what the major issue is. What is the issue that is at the basis of this complaint or of this conflict or of this? What is the main issue that we both can agree on as being something we need to work at? I make the statement in the yellow that this is a process that goes around and around and around and around, because you'll come together at the first place here and you'll have something you agree on. You'll work through the process, then you go, but there's more. You don't try and eat the elephant with one mouthful, because this process doesn't necessarily end because you've done this here. You'll go back around it again. So you come together in a treaty, you agree what is the important issue that you need to resolve, and then you will move down the bottom to where you would tell the truth, the old Dorinya, tell the truth. You will confess. There's a confession that comes in here somewhere. It may be a joint confession that says both people have behaved inappropriately in this situation. It may be a confession by one that says, yes, I am the reason for this situation. Or yes, I did behave in such a manner. And in this confession, you're also, this place of truth, you're telling what it feels like to be there. What you're not here after is a universal truth. Truth for Aboriginal people is contextual. It's the truth in the space that brings about wholeness and healing. So it's not a universal truth or a universal dictum that you're working at. Truth changes depending upon the context of time and place and people. Okay, that's why often when you talk to Aboriginal people that do something, they always say yes, when they probably feel no. But you're the white person, so yes is the best thing to say. Okay? And it happens all the time. So here we talk about telling the truth in the context of the situation we find ourselves in, and confessing to our part in the process. Sometimes here it's not just a confession, though. Sometimes here people have to go, but people, the elders, and I'll explain how it works for us in a minute, the elders would say, you're the problem. But that's happened because you've confessed by telling the truth about what goes on. Okay? So you have the voice of listening and hearing and reflecting, the recognition. Then you have the coming together and saying, these are the issues that we need to address. This is the treaty that we're coming up. This is what we're going to do. And this is how we are going to address them, by telling the truth about them, what it feels like. Getting people out of their intellectual head of defense into the gut of feeling, emotion. What's it feel like for me in this place? What's it feel like for the community in this place? What's it feel like for me if people say I'm the one responsible? What's it feel like for me who's been on the end of something that has been not nice? So you begin to get this coming together over, gosh, I feel like that too. Or I get how you feel, because that's how I feel. Handled properly, it allows us to move out of our head into our gut. Or if you're inside a Christian network, you would say inside your heart. But for us as Aboriginal, in your gut, your emotional connection to this whole story. And once that's done, the person who's confessed may say, well, then I'm responsible for repairing the damage done. Or the elders will say, this is how we're going to repair it, and there'll be process of repair for both of you in this going forward. And this is where we get to Makarata, come to life again, or be resurrected is the kind of word that we use in our own language, Marangala, which means we come together, come to life again. We come back whole. We're resurrected. We delink from the past and re-exist what is really important into the process. The spear, we talk a lot about spearing in the thigh, and really this is an important part of this story. A spearing in the thigh is the process of repair and learning, not necessarily payback, although there is a sense in which that is in. And we can't go crook about payback because we do payback through prison systems. We get revenge by locking people up. We can talk about justice, we can talk about a whole lot of things, but it's really about payback and revenge. Getting square. Put them in jail for as long as we need to. So the spear in the thigh means that once you've had a spear in the thigh, you learn a whole lot of lessons. You're not the center of the world. You cannot exist without others because now you can't go and get them feed because you can't catch kangaroos, because you can't run. You need others to look after you. And you realize that you have an important part to play in the whole that you're a part of. It shifts your understanding of yourself. And you learn that, and you never forget, because you with a spear in your thigh, you walk differently for the rest of your life. And you're a pedagogical witness to the rest of the community about how or how not to behave. So it's more than just getting square. It's a process of repair and learning. Okay? And in the end, what you're after is that bringing back together of the whole, making the whole. It's like in our understanding, the whole is less than the sum of the parts. Not the whole is greater than, the whole is less than. So, because you have no parts, you don't have a whole. So it's an important part of the process. You get wholeness back into the community and the community is able to move on. Doesn't mean the community moves on in a Disneyland kind of process. You move on with all the conflicts and difficulties that this issue has raised up, but the basic issues have been addressed and you move forward, if that makes sense. For example, you know, if two young men get into a brawl over something, perhaps over a girl, 5 minutes to go, yep, and there is somebody gets hurt or somebody, I'll give you a real life experience of a young lady who ended up in a jail because she had the opportunity in this process to spear the young man who had done damage to her, and she wasn't very accurate with the spear. I don't think they really understood it, and she speared him and he died. And she was only 16 or something, and she was pregnant, and they wanted to say, we'll move you out of this place and take you somewhere else, because if you go back there, they're going to break your arm or something's going to happen as part of this extra process that needed to happen. And she said, no, I want to go back because that is how community works. And that is how community puts things back together. And I have to do that if my community is not going to fall apart. Because as I said before, when these kind of things happen, we often put people in prison somewhere else. So there's no closure, no resolution, there's no process. Both sides of the discussion gets full of shame and guilt and anger because they can't get on with their lives because this hasn't been resolved. So when they do come back together 20 years later, they start where it was 20 years before. Conflict doesn't go away. Actually, it's got worse because it's been magnified by gossip and conversation and anger. For lots of our communities, it's important that we take this kind of process out of the hands of the authorities and into the hands of our communities and follow this in a way that does the resolution of conflict in our own spaces. You may say that spear in the thigh is brutal. We think going to jail 250 kilometres away is brutal. And it's brutal because it goes on for so long. So this is the kind of discussion process that I would like to see happen, particularly in reference to things like, professional standards and other complaints, so that we can get the process moving within the context in a way that brings people back together. Thank you.
Thanks, Uncle Glenn. I knew that I was up for a task in trying to get you to finish in 15 minutes with your storytelling, which is so important. And it is hard to try and wrap up because of the ancient wisdom there, as you would have heard. It sounds, there's some simplicity to it, but it's complex and it's deep and it's rich, and there's some things for us all to reflect on as we hold these conversations. So thank you. I'm going to move across now to Michael, and Michael's going to talk to us about some more contemporary type of restorative practices. Thanks, Michael.
Sure. Thanks, Fiona. Thank you, Glenn. Just thought before I launch off, we might just have a minute of quiet just to absorb what Glenn's been saying, and maybe think to ourselves whether there was a particular thought or take home in what Glenn was talking about before I start. I'll just give that a minute. All right, so my task is just to give a very quick snapshot of contemporary restorative practice. And by contemporary, I mean there's a bit of a lineage that we can track in what we call contemporary restorative practice from around about 1980 or the late 1970s, from the Mennonites' work, actually, particularly a guy called Howard Zier in the US, who was looking at better ways of dealing with youth justice issues with Indigenous communities in the US. And that was so successful. It was picked up in New Zealand very soon afterwards when they were looking again at youth justice issues there. And then from there, it was kind of translated across the Gulf to some initial pilot work that was done in youth justice in Wagga Wagga. And then it's kind of expanded within Australia. And so it's got kind of Indigenous roots from the US, Indigenous and Maori roots from New Zealand. And now, as Glenn was saying, increasingly seeing the connections between what Howard was developing from US roots and Indigenous practice here. So there's some really nice threads coming together. So I'm just going to kind of launch through some real summary slides here. And just so I stay on track, I'm going to hit a timer on my phone.
So, thank you.
Yeah, I've already done a minute or two. So just tell me, can you see that slide? Just give me a wave if you can.
Okay,
great.
Yeah.
So where is this coming from? So obviously I'm speaking about this as a Christian with a theological angle. That's a primary concern of mine. So what are we talking about when we talk about restorative justice is and why are we having this conversation in a church context, is that justice is such a central theme in the Judeo-Christian tradition. Justice is related to the concept of fairness. So we all have a sense of when we've been treated fairly or unfairly. And if you say, well, where does our sense of fairness come from? We might think in terms of fundamental human needs. So, for example, needs to belong to a community, needs to be taken seriously, to be seen, to have recognition, as Glenn was saying, to feel safe, needs for coherence or meaning, need to have agency, to have a sense of control over our own lives and things that affect us. And when these fundamental human needs are violated, it gives rise to very strong what we call biological affect in our bodies. So primary affects would be things like fear, anger, distress, or this last one, I just love this photograph, I want to share it with you, disgust, right? It's meant to kind of evoke this feeling of wanting to spit something out, which is potentially harmful for us. And it also made me laugh because I was thinking one person's disgust is another person's yum. Anyway, so we have these kind of foundational biological responses of fundamental needs being violated or not met. And when that happens, a legal complaint is frequently a cry for help to get these fundamental needs met, and it gives rise to legal systems. Now, I'm talking about the Western legal system here. It's the only one I'm familiar with, which is really a combination of a variety of things put together into what we call a justice system. So laws, for example, to establish desirable or bad behavior, or in the case of organizations, codes of conduct or codes of ethics, things like that. And then we need to, because we're wanting to be fair about it, we put into place investigative processes for determining facts. What happened? Is someone guilty? Is someone innocent? And so we need a whole infrastructure to manage that, police, courts, and so forth. So it moves from sense of fairness, human needs, complaint, laws, investigation, and then ultimately punishment. So that's a kind of a snapshot of how the legal system works and where it comes from. So it has a rationale to it in a way, and it has some benefits as well. So it provides boundary conditions for our common life. It provides individual deterrence, like that'll teach you. If you do that again, this is what's going to happen. It can provide collective deterrence. So let this be a lesson to a lot of you. Occasionally, it can be therapeutic, although ex-prisoners will tell you not very much. And as Glenn was saying, there's a big element of it is just meeting a fundamental need for hurting people. So revenge. At the very best, payback and revenge. At the very worst, we could call it state-sanctioned torture to send people to prison. So this is starting to touch on some of if you look at these as some of the upsides of why we have legal systems, and it can have some strength, particularly in determining what happened when people are in a state of denial. It also has some big downsides because no one likes to be accused of being a villain. So people tend to lawyer up and defend themselves. The victim and the villain each generate a story about their own virtuousness and the tyranny of the other. And so, for example, we get the villain here, the victim here, and of course, these are interchangeable roles because if I might think you're the villain, but you really see me as being the villain. So there's a kind of a mirroring effect going on potentially, particularly in complaints processes. And then usually some well-meaning person might step into the fray and try to rescue the whole situation and make it better. And then suddenly what you've got is tribes forming. And by tribes, I mean groups of people who have decided that the other group of people are a whole group of villains rather than just an individual villain. And it looks something like this. And pretty much, and then the whole life of the community potentially starts to degrade. So people in communities form tribal alliances, group alliances, um, and that is a problem because I'm going to talk very briefly in a moment about the issue of attribution error. So this is a well-recognized phenomenon in social psychology, that we tend to over-attribute individual causation and under-attribute social forces. So in finding somebody to blame for what's going on, we might call them a scapegoat, for example. It's one way of looking at it. We tend to under-attribute the fact that there's a whole bunch of people being involved in a conflict or an act of harm, but they're kind of getting off any kind of analysis or involvement in the solution because it's just being focused on the law breaking of one person. And the chance of learning then and the healing of relationships has been pretty much thrown out the window. So this is some of the downsides of an investigate complaints process. So what restorative justice does is that it tries to conceive of justice in a different way. Restorative justice does not ask the question, who is to blame? Restorative justice starts with a different question, which is, what happened here? If people are hurting, what are their needs and how can we set things right? And the common term, if we take principles of restorative justice out of criminal justice and put it into organisations, we call it restorative practices. So that's just a little bit of a terminology issue. So 3 components for effective restorative practices in organisations. 1, 2, 3. Basically, restorative practice in organisations is based on 3 fundamental principles. 1, do no further harm. So don't run through this process if it's going to make the situation worse. Secondly, work with people rather than doing things to them or for them. Criminal justice systems basically do things to people. Restorative practice processes do things with people. And then finally, it's aimed at setting relationships right. And so we often think of restorative justice as in this pointy end of the triangle, is repairing and resetting relationships. But really what restorative practice is doing in organisations is wanting to, how do we think much more comprehensively about how we actually establish relationships in the first place? How do we maintain those relationships over time? And if we do those 2 things well, we're less likely to have the need to do pointy end restorative justice work at the top. Inevitably, we will have to do some of that work because we're human and we make mistakes. But if we can bottom end it with the developmental work, good, then we're less likely to have problems later. And so we're going to have to support that through programs in organisations so that we can culturally embed this work. Culturally embed conditions in which honest and safe conversations are standard practice, where we develop a learning culture rather than a punitive culture, all right, and how we then move towards community flourishing through all that. So that's a quick snapshot of the kind of big picture of restorative practice. So what happens in the pointy end, and by pointy end I mean this repairing and resetting relationships. What happens in that pointy end of restorative practice? Well, everybody that's affected by a conflict or an act of harm is invited, and it's always voluntary participation, into a structured process with a trained facilitator. That's important because there's a sequence, as Glenn spoke about in the process he described as a circle. In contemporary restorative practice, there's also a sequence of steps. So telling stories, what happened, and how each person was affected by what happened. And through that storytelling and that listening process, providing a basis for gaining shared insights and learnings. Some kind of nice little parallel I heard there with the process Glenn described of coming to some sense of agreement about what shared agreement about what the actual issues are here. Generating ideas to how to improve the situation, particularly to reset relationships, and then agree on what's most useful and doable. So that's the steps that you work through in a restorative conferencing process. There's a few distinctive features of the process, which are a little unique. as I said before, it takes a communal approach rather than an individual approach. It tries to take the whole, everyone affected is brought into this circle. Restorative conferences are conducted in circles. Everyone affected and who is able to contribute to the solution is welcome. So we don't unilaterally exclude people from processes. And that helps deal with the issue of attribution error, which I mentioned earlier. Interestingly, in restorative conference processes, confidentiality is not absolute. And that's a distinctive feature compared to mediation. We actually want transparency and openness so that the community can learn and grow from the mistakes that it's made. And so if we have absolute confidentiality, that can make that quite difficult. So the limits of confidentiality are actually determined by the group in a restorative practice process. It requires goodwill, as I said, voluntary participation rather than strategic game playing. Lawyers generally do not attend, except if they're invited as support people and have a lot of constraints put around what they can actually do in a conference. Importantly, a restorative process does not remove legal options. So it is possible, in theory, for a person to go through a restorative conference and just say, I was not happy with that, and then make a formal complaint. However, because satisfaction rates with restorative conferencing are so high, it's almost unheard of that people will go into a formal complaint after a restorative practice process, at least one that's been very well run. But it doesn't remove the possibility. It gives people the freedom to pursue the legal track if they want to. And anything discussed in a restorative conference can't be used in a subsequent complaints process. So that gives participation safety for people to tell their stories. Recognizing that sometimes formal or legal investigative processes may still be needed. In what kind of situations? Well, allegations of criminal or serious misbehaviour. There may be legal tracks that we are by law required to go down. Where there's a lack of good faith, it can't work. Requires people to come in with good faith and a capacity and willingness to be humble and to learn. It's difficult to run restorative practice when there are disputed facts. For example, when there's a denial that there's a problem or that one of the parties are unwilling to examine themselves. And where there's threatening or coercive behaviour which may affect participation safety. So, different pathways for different needs. Sometimes we do need investigation and adjudication processes, and complaints resolution departments have traditionally been set up to do that work effectively. Sometimes you just got to train people how to be more skilled in their management and leadership. Often, people who work in this field will tell you all the time that often we end up in conflict with each other, not because of malevolence, but simple sheer incompetency. So training people how to be better managers can help a lot. Conflict coaching, which helps people to explore options. Mediation, which is sometimes called interest-based negotiation. That's particularly useful if there's not a legacy of conflict and harm, but you just need someone to assist you through a series of negotiation steps. Collaborative deep listening processes like talking circles, open space technology, theory U, retreating. That's telling me my time's nearly up. And then restorative practice conferencing, which is what I've been talking about. I could come back to a story later, but I've run out of time. Theological foundations for restorative justice are that God is righteous. And by righteous, we mean God acts to deliver people from the oppressive forces that erode and destroy relationships. So envy, rivalry, competition, exploitative power, weaponized law, violence, and restore us to relationship. God is in the restoration business, the restoration of relationships business. That is the foundation for doing this work. And finally, if you want to know more, some links. This is the slide to take a photograph of right now if you need more information. some good resources at the Australian Association for Restorative Justice. You can become a member for $50 and get regular mailings. That's just a little sales pitch from me. Australian Restorative Mapping, the NED Foundation, is doing some great work on what's happening in Australia. Peace and Nonviolence Education Network has got some good stuff in there on peace and nonviolence and restorative justice. Or give me a call. And these slides will also be available on a PDF, which I will send to Fiona. And sorry for going 2 minutes over. Fiona, back to you.
No, all good. Thank you very much for that, Michael. I can certainly, it certainly resonates to me around the villain and victim kind of dynamic that you can get into, and the attribution error. That's really a good thing for us to be mindful of in terms of blame and the bigger system. It reminds me of some of the work that Kira has done in terms of a prevention framework around looking at the culture of organisations where abuse can flourish versus not, and focusing on bad apples rather than a barrel of apples, you know, those sorts of things. Lifting your gaze up and looking wider at the issues that are happening in a system, and not just focusing so much on individual blame. Of course, there is a space for accountability in there as well. I was also struck, Michael, by the threads that you mentioned to Uncle Glenn's work, the circles, the communal response, those sorts of things. There is definitely been an evolution from those ancient roots. Now, going along in Michael's very thoughtful way, let's have a bit of a reflection for a minute on Michael's presentation too, and then I'll pass over to Anna. Anna, you're okay to go? Did you have a slide? I thought you might have had one. No slide. That's good. All right, let's take a minute.
I'd firstly like to acknowledge that I'm joining from Dharawal land this evening, and within that very much recognising that the lands upon which I am and we all are today always have been and always will be Aboriginal land. So thank you all for welcoming me into this space, and a big thanks to Glenn and Michael for all of the wisdom that you've already shared. It's been wonderful listening to you. I think what I thought about in terms of bringing some of my work to this space is particularly around the work that I do as a restorative practice facilitator and a restorative justice facilitator. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why I'm sort of using those two different terms and distinctions around that. I guess to set a little bit of context, Fiona shared some of my work experience, and I think I've been working in really and looking at institutional responses to harm and conflict for about the last 25 years, and doing a lot of work in Royal Commissions, both here and overseas. And I think within that, acknowledging that there always needs to be, I think at least in this current climate, survivors of harm to be able to seek criminal justice responses and or civil responses if they want. There's also, of course, a place for investigative responses within any organisational context. But I have felt and continue to feel stronger every day that part of my role is to agitate assumptions around those systems or those responses being required or mandated within organisational or other contexts. Because I think throughout my work, I've come to understand that not only for those harmed, but those accountable for harm and others, so often those systems and responses don't actually really have the capacity to understand and listen to the needs of the people who have been impacted. And so that's really motivated me to do the work that I do, and I continue to do. I think I just wanted to share a little bit about how I see that distinction, and probably talking about restorative practice all the way through to restorative justice. The work that I do really is on a continuum. I do a lot of work in conflict resolution and very much utilise restorative principles and practice within responding and facilitating those processes, all the way through to my facilitation of restorative justice responses, where it might be someone who has been profoundly impacted by child sexual abuse or adult sexual assault. And I think along that continuum, I think it's important to recognise that whilst restorative practice can attend to and respond to interpersonal conflict, at that point, there is the capacity for different experiences to be negotiated in a way, and for multiple truths to exist sort of at the same time. Whereas within, when you then continue on up to the form of harm, whether it could be child sexual abuse or adult sexual assault, I very much premise kind of what I'm going to say, that there is no negotiation of that harm within that context. And for a restorative justice opportunity to take place, there needs to be, and particularly for the person who's been so deeply harmed, an acceptance and an acknowledgement of that harm without trying to negotiate or minimise out of that the harm that's occurred. So I guess that's sort of what I'd like to share about my practice. I've done a lot of work in faith-based organisations using restorative principles in response to conflict. And whilst I don't know everyone here, I appreciate that you've all probably got a pretty good understanding of the level of complexities and conflict that exists in faith-based organisations, and how we can think about alternative and creative responses to that conflict that really attends to and listens to the needs of the people deeply impacted. And so that's quite a lot of my work. Just acknowledging too, in my restorative justice, I do a lot of that conflict work within faith-based organisations on my own, and I can kind of I feel that I have capacity to hold those spaces kind of on my own. In the restorative justice work that I do, because it's attending to such profound harm of child sexual abuse and adult sexual assault, I actually do that work with a wonderful organisation called Transforming Justice Australia. I'm very happy to share more information about them, but that's a community-based organisation. And because of the nature and complexity of that work, we have multiple people working on the one process, and that, for instance, those processes, we co-facilitate them, and there's often also specific support for the person harmed, and the accountability specialist might work with the person responsible for the harm. So just to acknowledge, because of the nature and complexity of that work, I very much do that work within an organisational kind of support. But as I said, I'm really happy to share that information more after this. And I guess one of the most important things I think to share too is that, as I think, Michael, you had reflected on, I think when contemplating restorative and just to think about the responses to conflict, that to always think about restorative practice as an alternative response, knowing that for whatever reason, if the nature of the process, for instance, because of course it's fundamentally voluntary, if for whatever reason one or more of the participants actually no longer wants to participate, that they've always got those kind of formal, more investigative responses available to them. But I think it's really about trying to see other options that don't fall within those response mechanisms, to try and look at sort of alternative ways of responding. So I just wanted to acknowledge that in the work that's, I think that's necessary. And as you said, Fiona, I think choice and agency is really is really important. And I think one of my main experiences in organisational context is, I think, if there continues to only be formal complaints mechanisms available as a response, I think that will continue to act as a barrier for people actually disclosing or reporting the conflict or the harm that they've that has deeply impacted them, because there's all sorts of reasons. And I know as a group we all understand how difficult and complex investigative responses can be, particularly because I think it often can work within a context of really, because of the mechanisms based on individual findings of behaviour, the nuancing around conflict actually often being a contribution of multiple participants and kind of dynamics influencing that conflict. It often, I think, complaints mechanism doesn't attend to the possibility of accountability and factors influencing conflict actually having multiple layers. So I think that that's a really important thing about thinking beyond formal complaints mechanisms and thinking more about restorative practice. So I guess I just also wanted within this space to share a few examples. I thought that might be helpful of, I guess, talking about that continuum of work that I engage in. I guess a couple of things that I'd like to share. One is that the nature of the conflict and all the harm, as you will see in my examples, is very varied. And utilising those same restorative principles and practice, I think it can attend to so many different forms of conflict and or harm. I think the key aspect that really is fundamental to any restorative approach, certainly in the work that I do, is the immense preparation that takes place before any form of circle or dialogue. And that's very much recognising that often, as we all know, when someone has been deeply impacted by interpersonal conflict or harm, to create the level of trust and clear expectations required to ensure that they feel safe when they come into dialogue or they engage in a restorative process with someone, that can take quite a lot of work and time. And really attending to that preparation phase, I think, is fundamental to ensuring that it is really, really safe when people come into dialogue or circle together. So I guess with that, not only the nature of the conflict and harm can be so varied, but also where people are at in terms of their own journey after they've been either impacted by conflict or harm. So just to give you some examples, I have been asked by faith-based and other organisations to come in and facilitate a restorative response following an investigation. That can be due to the fact that the investigation reaches findings that aren't substantiated, but, for instance, the committee or panel or whoever the governance authority is recognises that the conflict still did have a significant impact despite the behaviours not reaching the relevant organisational threshold, and so offering a restorative practice model to attend to those needs and really try and repair and restore kind of the relationship if that's ongoing. One thing I think it's really important to just share that made me think of in terms of that distinction between responding to conflict and sort of restorative practice and restorative justice is that I want to acknowledge the agency when someone has been subject to behaviours and harm such as child sexual abuse and adult sexual assault. They have absolute agency in determining whether they want any form of relationship with the person who's harmed them. So I think there's a real distinction there between restorative practice that might aim to repair relationship or set relationships right, and that can often be a real goal within the context of conflict. But just when there's such profound harm in relation to sexual abuse, that of course the survivor has every right to say, I want a restorative justice process, but I actually don't want an ongoing relationship with the person who's harmed me following that process. So I just kind of wanted to acknowledge that. So I guess just in terms of, as I said, post-investigation, that's certainly something I've been brought in. Recognising the deep impact of investigative responses on people can often really sometimes damage relationships more. And I think we've all seen that in our work, and trying to provide restorative opportunities to try and restore and repair some harm after investigative responses have taken place. I've also done a lot of work where institutions have recognised that people's needs are actually much more aligned with a restorative process than with an investigative response. That often also in conflict spaces where people are flagging or acknowledging a level of accountability in their contribution to the conflict. Of course, if someone has a really staunch position that they actually don't hold any accountability in relation to conflict, that can often be very difficult to work with within a restorative process. So I think that's something that's important to think about when thinking about working with people and what might be coming up that is restorative. Another example was a sexual assault between two adult men that occurred in a faith-based organisation. They had a mentoring relationship, and I was asked to come in. The person who caused the harm already held a level of accountability, and the person harmed really sought a restorative response to the sexual assault that they'd experienced, and so I facilitated that process. I've also done work where a DPR in relation to child sexual abuse has evolved into a survivor of harm expressing needs for a restorative justice process following a DPR in relation to the National Redress Scheme. So that's just to give you an example of another another sort of context of some of the work that I've done. A lot of conflict within parishes, and really acknowledging, I think, what you did, Michael, that sometimes those conflicts, there might be only really two participants, but often I've been asked to facilitate restorative process where, because of the collective nature of the impact of the harm in a parish context, it's actually meant the holding of multiple circles within that parish to attend to the really significant impacts that the conflict has had within that parish community. So just as an example. I'm conscious, should I be coming to a close?
Yes.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so look, I have, it's very difficult to kind of sum up examples, but I hope it sort of resonated with you. And I think the main messaging I wanted to really share is that restorative practice can really attend to such a continuum of behaviours, and I think it's just such a creative and adaptive way of being and understanding and working and acknowledging needs. So I just I think that it's sort of limitless in terms of what it can do in the spaces in which we work. So, and thank you so much for listening. And yeah, of course, any questions?
Thank you, Anna. That was really helpful to step through some of the complexities, particularly with child sexual abuse and adult sexual abuse, and the importance of trauma-informed practice in use, as you said, choice, agency, and ensuring that those sorts of restorative processes are not perpetrating more harm and are led in a way that's safe and helpful for the survivor to move forward. Okay, well, we could give you some time to reflect on Anna's presentation, but I think what we might do is jump to questions. So if you want to put your little hand up or just wave to me, I'm going to scan. I've got a couple of pages of people to scan and go through, or you can pop your questions in the chat. You can direct them to anyone in particular or the group, and this is just an opportunity to really reflect on what's just been presented, but also think about it in the context from which we're operating. We predominantly have spoken about faith-based contexts, but this is applicable across any sector or any organisation. So yes, please feel free to pop your hands up or a question in the chat.